This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
With at least a dozen national elections scheduled for 2019, steady economic growth estimated at 4.1%, and bustling investment and infrastructural projects spread across the continent, 2019 is already shaping up to be an eventful year for Africa. But with existing challenges in security and on the economic front, coupled with an increasingly changing climate with adverse effects in the region, what lessons will Africa take from 2018 as it embraces yet another new year? And what else can the continent expect in 2019? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. My expert panel of guests is on standby to help us look into Africa in 2019. But before that, let's take a look at a snapshot of key upcoming events in the new year.
2019 is gearing up to be a busy year for Africa. In January, the AU summit will be held in Addis Ababa and the final results of the Democratic Republic of Congo election are expected. February sees elections in both Nigeria and Senegal. Parliamentary elections will be held in March in Madagascar, and Kigali will be hosting the Africa CEO Forum for the first time. Africa also celebrates World Wildlife Day on the 3rd of March. April brings more elections in Algeria this time, and the Mo Ibrahim Foundation will be holding their governance weekend in Abidjan. Rwanda will be holding a day of remembrance for the victims of the genocide on April the 7th. May sees eagerly anticipated elections scheduled in both South Africa and Malawi. We'll also celebrate Africa Day on May 25th and the International Day of UN Peacekeepers on May 29th. The Africa Development Bank is scheduled to hold its annual meetings in Malabo between May 20th and the 24th. Africa's biannual football extravaganza, the Africa Cup of Nations, kicks off in Senegal on June 15th for a month-long feast of football. July brings us the AU Africa Women's Day and also the World Population Day. In September, the 74th session of the UN General Assembly takes place in New York. More African elections are due to be held in October in Botswana, Mozambique, and Tunisia. October 17th is demarcated as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. December brings World AIDS Day on the 1st and International Migrants Day on the 18th.
A few highlights there for key upcoming events in the year 2019. Let's now explore Africa's prospects in the new year. And to help us assess the forecasts, I'm joined by Dr. Ziad Akl. He's in Cairo. He's a political analyst and researcher at the Ahram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. With me in studio, Dr. Francis Mangeni, Director of Trade and Customs at the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, and Dr. Bob Wekesa, Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Thank you all for joining in the discussion. I want to start off with before we get to the specifics of what we expect in 2019, though, what do you think are the likely issues that will chart Africa's path in 2019, Dr. Wekesa?
I think 2019 promises to be as exciting as last year, in the sense that we're expecting at least two big elections. You know, South Africa and Nigeria go to the polls, and when these two giants in the southern and western part of the continent go to the polls, there's always some level of excitement. But don't you forget also we have 10 other African countries also going to the polls. Politically, therefore, it's exciting. On the economic front, we are going to be looking at how the Continental Free Trade Area shapes out. I mean, last year was a year of lots of promise, with the launch and lots of excitement about interconnectivity on the continent. So we're going to see if it will fly or fall, and that will be exciting on that front. So these are some of the expectations then for 2019.
Dr. Mangeni.
I think a critical issue for 2019 is innovation. That's number one. Number two is innovation. And number three is innovation. I think 2019 must be a year of innovation, taking up from where we left last year in 2018. We have been talking about industrialization. Industrialization only happens when you produce new goods and services and put them on the market. Without that, the economy stagnates. You are trapped into the existing cycles. So we need innovation to come on board. And innovation is not only with regard to industrialization, it's with regard to infrastructure, with regard to transportation, energy, and ICT, and services. So this is what we need to watch, taking into account that we have got this youth bulge. The mean age in Africa is 19.4. This is really young. Now the youth are known for their energy, their ideas. So we need innovation so that a framework is in place which assists or enables our people, especially the youth, to convert their ideas, their skills into businesses, into practical products and services for the market.
Right. Dr. Ziad Akl, your thoughts?
Well, I have to agree with your dear guest. I think that 2019 is a year that is very pivotal or important for Africa, because either economically or politically there are some new venues that Africa is about to consider. So for example, if you are talking about the international involvement, the political international involvement in Africa, there is a lot of foreign investment that is being poured into Africa at the moment. And also there are some of tools of soft power that Africa has that can actually improve its position within the international community. So there are many challenges that Africa is facing in 2019, and of course there is, specifically in the Arab countries of Africa, there is a change in political leadership and a change in international alliances, and that will reflect eventually on the continent from the inside. So 2019 will be a year so full of challenges for the African continent.
Right. I do want to come back to you, Dr. Wekesa, because you mentioned the two leading economies that will be having elections. And of course, we know both these economies have recently come out of recessions. What are your expectations regarding those two countries?
No, I think the elections will be pretty good for both countries. You know, when you look at South Africa, for example, sometimes when we are in other parts of the continent, we are worried about South Africa, imagining that it's going to go the way of other basket case countries or so-called banana republics on the continent. But it's actually a very stable country. So that so much so that the noise you hear on the streets and in the political circles, in the parliament in South Africa, is actually democracy at work. You know, the people do not end up in blows. We are moving away. We've moved away from the era of Jacob Zuma in the last year. Effectively, President Cyril Ramaphosa is now fully in control. However, the area of concern, even as we go to the election, is that the land question has been made a pivotal and a central issue to the campaigns and to the political situation there. So I think that is one area where one has to be concerned, because in many other African countries, specifically countries such as Kenya, Algeria, and Zimbabwe, the land question became such a hot potato that it actually has been a recurrent flashpoint you know, over the years. With regards to Nigeria, it's actually very interesting that President Muhammadu Buhari has done pretty well. I mean, even with ill health, being in and out of hospital in London particularly. Right. But essentially the Nigerians are actually pretty, you know, gung-ho about his prosecution of the corruption, you know, issue. I mean, it has lessened substantially. Even though he has not been able to eviscerate completely the Boko Haram menace to the northeast, Nigeria is seeming to get back to its huge potential, which has always remained untapped. So with the election, we expect that Buhari will make it back, and that then he will do his final term and perhaps stabilize that very important nation in the western part of the continent.
Dr. Ziad Akl, you mentioned that there is a bit of change in the political leadership in North Africa. President El-Sisi of Egypt will be taking over the African Union chairmanship for 2019. Is he likely to continue with the reforms and agenda of the African Union, or what's likely to be his priority as he comes in from the north?
I think that in 2019, the African Union must develop a new agenda because there are changes within the political leaderships all over the continent. And there is some sort of a setback within the role of the African Union, meaning that a lot of the African countries right now are acting independently outside of the framework of the Union. The Union still does not have an inclusive agenda that can actually foster cooperation within Africa. And this is something that it has to change within 2019 because the African Union is an organization that has proved at earlier times that it is capable of inducing change within the continent. But right now, it seems that there is an error within the communication between the different nations that are parts of the African Union. So 2019 must witness a reorganization process of the African Union agenda, politically and economically. But I think politically is much more important right now because of the set of changes that the continent is undergoing.
Right. Dr. Mangeni, you work for a regional body, COMESA. There is a need for reorganization of the African Union, but President Kagame has been spearheading reforms of that institution. What should 2019 hold for the African Union?
Right. So as President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt takes over the chairmanship of the African Union from President Paul Kagame, who has performed very well, I think the starting point is that continuity. There shouldn't be a drastic disconnect from what has been happening under the sterling leadership of President Paul Kagame. And as you rightly say, President Paul Kagame has done a lot of good work, which has been appreciated by Africa at large, on reforming the African Union with respect to financing. It has been agreed that a 0.2% levy should be put on imports in terms of imports duties and contributed or remitted to the African Union. In terms of making the African Union as an institution efficient, a reduction of the commissions from the current 8 to 6, combining the duplicative ones, and then dealing away with the bureaucracy within the institution itself, sharing of roles. Then secondly, we must continue to pursue Agenda 2063, which is a broad agenda for delivering the Africa we want. And the Africa we want is an integrated, peaceful, and prosperous Africa. So we must continue following this. And it has got 12 flagship programs, 3 of which have already been achieved in 2018, namely the Continental Free Trade Area, movement of persons, as well as the single African air transport market. I say achieved in terms of putting in place the frameworks, the instruments, but we need, of course, to implement those frameworks now. So this is extremely important. But in order to have the Africa you want, I like to say that we must have the Africans we want. We must have people in Africa who can deliver this Africa we want. And this means we need efficient leaders, we need political leaders who have vision and who can provide leadership, and we need youth also who can own the process.
Right. Dr. Akl, I just want to come back to Egypt's position, having taken over the African Union chairmanship for 2019. Is this now a reaffirmation of Egypt's true position as part of the African continent?
Well, there is a lot of interest within the Egyptian political leadership to become more involved in Africa, to become more involved through the African Union. There are specific issues that Egypt is very concerned about. First of all, there is the water security issue, which has a lot to do with the Ethiopian-Egyptian relationships. Second of all, there is the illegal immigration issue, which Egypt, as a country that is on a coast, and as a country neighboring to Libya, which is witnessing a lot of inflow of illegal immigrants, is very interested in. And there's, of course, the issue of radical Islam and radicalization and terrorism that also Egypt wants to cooperate with Africa on it. Fourth, there are a lot of infrastructure projects and intra-economic activities that could be done within African nations and that need some sort of an organization to coordinate all these affairs. So Egypt has a very clear policy about Africa. It is one of the most important foreign policy files at the Egyptian political leadership at the moment.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. We are going to take a short break now, but we'll continue to explore Africa's prospects in 2019 in just a moment. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue looking at Africa into 2019, and my expert panel is here to help us analyze the issues. Dr. Ziad Akl, the United States now has a new Africa policy released in 2018. In terms of the international community, what should we expect that relationship to look like for Africa in 2019?
I think Africa is becoming one of the areas of target for international powers, and it is going to be in 2019 one of the zones or the regions that actually international powers will fight over their influence within it. It is not necessarily going to be a military influence, but rather an economic influence. There's a lot of infrastructure projects that there are major powers within the Western world that are trying to secure their presence in Africa at the moment. And at the same time, there is also a desire to actually have more of an African compact situation. And that is some of African nations working upon right now in order to actually benefit from the international community's interest within Africa. So if we are talking about what should Africa do, first of all, Africa should revive the African Union as a representation of its interests. And second of all, there should be much more alliances between African countries and specifically within the North and the South, because there is a lot of common interests that could be secured if such frameworks of cooperation do exist. So 2019 is an opportunity for Africa to re-establish its relationship with the West, specifically with the United States, Russia, and China, who are the most 3 powers interested in actually enhancing or improving their relationship with the African continent.
Right, Dr. Wekesa?
Yeah, I think this is an old wine in new wineskins, if I'm not getting the phrase wrong. Every time China has had a new policy towards Africa, there's been a knee-jerk reaction from Washington in the sense of saying, look, we are losing out. China is taking the lead on the continent, and we must try and do catch up and perhaps even flex our muscle as a superpower. And in fact, it's not just the US. I will put it that China's success on the African continent in terms of forging fraternal relations with African countries, regardless of the criticism, is actually the trigger for not just the US, but in the recent time we've seen lots of Western leaders troop to the continent. Theresa May, Angela Merkel, the French President Macron, all have been coming here to look for deals because they realize that a continent that they had deserted has actually capacity to grow and still has potential. So I will take it that the US African policy is to some respect motivated by geopolitical competition rather than perhaps straight innate relations. However, I think as Africans, we have to be smart, and we already are actually smart. When you are a low guy on the block, you do not pick fights with anybody, but you try and find what strategic relations you can undertake with various countries. In fact, as a number of analysts have rightly pointed out, it is very unlikely that we'll get much of development resources from Washington. It's more of the whole talk of governance and democracy and so forth from the West, and more of the resources for infrastructure development and other forms of development from the East, particularly from China.
Right, Dr. Mangeni, your thoughts?
Yes, the strategy is still being worked on. So I think that as it's being finalized, the US should shift gear from competition with China on the continent to partnerships. The US is a huge economy and has got capacity to do good for Africa and around the world, notwithstanding the isolationism of President Trump. We hope that is going to be short-lived, and we go back to the traditional America as we know it, a multilateral supporter. You know, a supporter of the idea that humankind is family. We need to work together. We need multilateral institutions to guarantee international peace and prosperity. We hope we are getting there. So this new strategy needs to be informed by the best interests of the US, which are in terms of having a prosperous Africa, which can be a partner for the US, and working with all the other countries that are operating on the continent, such as China, to complement each other.
Right. Dr. Wekesa, I do want to come back to what Dr. Mangeni is talking about, multilateralism and globalization, key words for 2018. In 2019, though, how will that be played out, particularly Africa's position in here? How will all that be played out?
Multilateralism is not necessarily in a very good place, because you first of all look at the fact that the home of multilateralism is the US, because the UN headquarters is based in New York. The American post World War II leaders are the ones who crafted some of the best ideas that went into that. However, I think Africa then needs to work with countries that still believe in the UN as a global body, and then forge partnership, particularly because Agenda 2063 ties pretty well with SDGs, the Agenda 2030. There's a benefit, a direct benefit there for Africans that we should continue pursuing, working in partnership with like-minded people. And when you say like-minded people, again, we'll settle down to the Chinese, the Japanese, perhaps. So a number of European countries, especially Germany and UK perhaps. But then we must also be fully aware that certain traditional partners that used to support us within the UN family within the UN family will not be available to support us.
Ziad, Akl, as we come to the end of this program, your thoughts on looking back at 2018 and the issues that dominated Africa then. In 2019, what do you think, in your view, Africa should be concentrating on going into 2019?
I think there are two main points that we need as Africans to consider in 2019. First of all, that there needs to be a lot of internal reformations done in African countries. These have to do with having more democratization, more constitutional democracy, and also more transparency. And at the same time, sort of an economic openness to international investment. The second thing is that we need to ask ourselves to what extent is the African Union has become effective as an organization representing Africa, and do alliances between states, can they prove more efficient or more effective than the African Union? For example, if you look at the case in Libya, which is one of the most concise points of conflict in Africa, you would find that the neighboring countries' alliance between Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria is a lot more effective within the situation there than the African Union. So do we need to make more micro alliances between states that have common interests within the continent? I think 2019 must be the year that we reconfigure or rethink what sort of organization is the best to represent Africa.
Right, Dr. Mangeni.
We must continue the fight against corruption. Under the new theme of refugees and migration, we need to look closely into this matter because our youth continue to die in the Mediterranean, in the seas, in the deserts, needlessly, I should add, because there are lots of opportunities on the continent. That's why everybody is coming here. So it's ironical that everybody is coming here. They see opportunities, but our youth are going away. Education systems. I think we need a system of education called the Entrepreneurial University. This has been pioneered around the world, where instead of producing graduates who simply leave the university with a piece of paper, a certificate or a diploma or a degree, they leave with a business idea. The research they do during their years of study at the universities, at the institutions of higher learning, should be with a view to developing a commercializable idea. They should not just do some very theoretical things which really don't have practical use in the world. Right. But this can also be in the area of politics. They should do ideas which give them a platform when they finish school for making the world a better place. And then lastly, 2019 must be the year when the Continental Free Trade Area comes into force. But not much will happen in year one when the Continental Free Trade Area comes into force, because there are long transition periods of up to 10 years, 13 years, or in some cases even 15 years. So the Continental Free Trade Area will come into force, but the transition period will have to play out before you reap the full benefits of the Continental Free Trade Area.
Right.
Sure. So I think I'm very optimistic about 2019. It appears we are always optimistic for, even in 2020 we'll still be
Which
optimistic.
area are you the most optimistic about for 2019? I'm
very optimistic that some of the reforms at the AU that have already been put in motion will continue. Particularly optimistic for Continental Free Trade Area. It's a very important area. I'm also optimistic that our integration through infrastructure, infrastructure related roads, railways, and so forth, will gain steam. Why? Because only recently we appointed a very energetic African leader called former Kenyan Prime Minister called Raila Odinga, who I hope will throw a lot of his energy much more in the continental infrastructure development rather than just focus on his energy in the Kenyan political scene. I think he's been given the job of his dreams. If he can help us with connectivity in the various corridors that have already been identified that cross-cut the continent, working with developing partners, that will be a very optimistic step and it will see us grow. So, but in a nutshell, I'm always an optimistic.
Right. On that optimistic note, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for your insights. Dr. Ziad Akl in Cairo. He's a political analyst and researcher with the Ahram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. And with me in studio, Dr. Bob Wekesa, postdoctoral fellow at the University of Witwatersrand, and Dr. Francis Mangeni, Director of Trade and Customs at the Common Market for East and Southern Africa. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can reach us through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. And do keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, it's goodbye and Happy New Year.